Let's talk about the black experience after the European enslavement trade had ended up until present, so that we might understand the current predicament of black people. And please, for a start, Abraham Lincoln didn't free the slaves. After the Civil War, the war which was the black Africans' victory for the abolition of slavery, black people and abolitionists intelligently used the hypocritical rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence to politically fight for our freedom. The Declaration of Independence being the declaration made after the American War of Independence against the British, who previously controlled what is now the USA. In all actuality, black Africans have been waging constant small and large scale revolts from the beginning until the end of the European enslavement trade. Africans in Africa fought against enslavers to not get captured in the first place. In some cases, they overthrew whole ships. They even jumped overboard to die and be with their ancestors rather than be enslaved. And in some cases, like Palmares, they took control of whole provinces from colonialists. In Haiti, they took their freedom under control of a nation. By the end of the American Civil War, 37,000 black Africans died fighting for our freedom. Overall, 178,000 black Africans fought and ultimately won the war. And though Abraham Lincoln testified to slavery being wrong, he also openly stated his belief that white people were superior to black people and that we should be segregated from one another. The truth is, we forced his hand and then they moved the goalposts. Or perhaps they had a new system of slavery in mind. They did not suddenly grow a conscience anyway, considering that shortly after the abolition of slavery, the European elites got together in what was coined the Rush for Africa to plan the colonization of Africa, which all seems to coincide with the end of the European enslavement trade and the ongoing Industrial Revolution. You see, bankers began investing more and more in factories rather than crop production. Powerful industries in Britain supported an end to slavery because they argued that the cheap wage labour in factories was more efficient and profitable than plantation slavery. The US followed suit, instilling the same cheap wage labour factory system. Now add to all this the revolts of black Africans, which by today's value was costing them millions upon millions of dollars. So as industry began to take off, European elites saw Africa as a source of raw materials and a market for mass-produced goods. And so these ethically, compassionately charged supreme civilized beings from Europe set about colonizing Africa. That was sarcasm, by the way. Anyway, going back to the post-Civil War predicament of black Americans. After the Civil War ended, 4 million enslaved Africans were handed their freedom. But were they really? A huge coincidence happened during the Civil War, when the US government implemented the Homestead Act policy of 1862, which offered free or inexpensive land in the US, and this attracted huge numbers of poor, working-class European immigrants. The US had a relatively open immigration policy at the time, for white people that is, which made it easy for the European people to enter the country. Between 1870 and 1920, around 20 million Europeans had arrived. So think about what effect that had on the newly freed black African. It pushed the cost of labour down. We now had to compete with the poor white working class, and you can bet that meant we were, in many cases, worse off than we were when we were actually enslaved. You see, before the 16th century, Europe already had its own social class system, but since white supremacy was created, black people were now at the bottom of the social hierarchy. In the post-Civil War environment, many blacks now found themselves homeless. They had to pay their way while still working on plantations, not making enough money to survive, and most definitely not enough to build a better future. So essentially all that changed was law and the rhetoric. The actions and systems of slavery still remained. During slavery, colonialists created the slave codes, the laws of slavery with regard to black Africans, placing them at the bottom, deeming them and their offspring soulless property to do with as they pleased. After slavery was supposedly abolished, the new laws brought in post-slavery were called the Black Codes. The Black Codes included new employment laws, requirements to pay taxes, and strict vagrancy laws with requirements for travel passes. Vagrancy laws essentially made it illegal to be homeless or without work. So you can see with the added aspect of travel restrictions, black people could still end up trapped working in the same southern plantations for less, as in food, cost of living, than they were when they were enslaved. And for any act of defiance, they could be made homeless, unemployed, and then be arrested, imprisoned, or rather forced back into these prison plantations. I literally could write a whole book on the Black Codes alone. So what exactly was the purpose of the Black Codes then? The purpose of the Black Codes was to regain control over the now free black people, inhibit the freedom and travel of the previously enslaved black people, prevent black uprisings, ensure the continued supply of cheap labor, maintain segregation, no mixing, no unification of the poor classes. essentially maintain white supremacy in as much as it maintains the global elite, installing a new financial system of slavery. The black codes that included vagrancy laws led to a system of penalties and punishments, including convict leasing, that put freed black people back into forced labor on the plantations. Vagrancy laws enabled the old system of slavery to coexist with the new system post 13th Amendment. Black people were accused with all manner of lies at this time and were normally in on jumped up charges, or stealing for the necessity of survival. Or like I previously said, if they stood up to their former owner, now employer, with regard to working conditions or anything for that matter, they could end up unemployed, homeless, and then arrested under these vagrancy laws, which would lead them back to these prison plantations, sometimes indefinitely for life. Let's move on to the next phase of injustices done to black people: Jim Crow laws. The Black Codes were a new system of slavery to re-enslave the newly freed black people. The Jim Crow laws, however, that came shortly after was the filling in of the cracks of that new system, the icing on the white supremacist cake. Jim Crow laws were introduced in the US in the 1890s. The southern states began to systematically strengthen constitutionally to subordinate the position of black people. Most of these laws were created to segregate black people in public settings, to deny them access to amenities such as schools, restaurants, transportation, and restrooms, and most importantly, to not allow black men to vote. Residential segregation kept black communities confined to certain neighborhoods, often with poor living conditions, limited resources, and inadequate access to essential services like education and healthcare. Employment discrimination relegated black individuals to the worst jobs, with low wages and little opportunity for advancement. Social segregation fostered racial animosity and perpetuated negative stereotypes, further marginalizing black people in society. The systemic racism embedded in these legal frameworks reinforced the narrative of black inferiority and white supremacy, perpetuating a cycle of inequality and injustice that continues to affect black African American communities to this very day. In every state of the former Confederacy, the system of legalized segregation and disempowerment was fully in place by 1910, but the system of white supremacy cut across class boundaries and reinforced a cult of whiteness that predated the Civil War. Segregation was in fact a nationwide experience for black people, and not just bound to the southern states. With the changing of the economy landscape due to the Industrial Revolution and the damage and cost of the Civil War, the southern economy spiraled downward in the 1890s. Black people became targets for white rage, called by one historian the lowest point of the post-slavery black experience. Now let's talk about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Along with the creation of the Black Codes and the Jim Crow laws, white supremacists needed another means to keep black people in check, to better maintain their white supremacy. So in December 1865, they established a secret terror organization called the Ku Klux Klan. This terror group could work alongside the law, carrying out brutal illegal attacks under hood and cloak, so that the police and government would not be complicit. In fact, law enforcement officers, government officials, and business owners were often members. They could continue to satisfy their savage urges that during the enslavement trade they could get away with, being that black people were then deemed as property. They would lynch black men, torture them, sometimes remove their genitalia if they supposedly had looked at a white woman. They would sometimes RPE black women and daughters in front of their bound husbands and then hang them all. They would burn African homes to the ground, sometimes with them in it. They would have what they called NIGGER barbecues. This terror group and other splinter white supremacy groups continue to operate to this day, but particularly they operated strongly from 1865 to the 1960s. So what else have black people had to endure since seemingly gaining our freedom? Sundown towns. Towns became known as sundown towns, towns where black people were not welcome. They would often have signs upon entering the town stating "No NIGGERS," or stating for black people to be aware of being caught after sundown, hence the term sundown towns. After slavery ended in 1865, there were black towns and many towns that had black neighborhoods. White mobs strategically lynched, unalived, RP'd, and terrorized these communities, often burning them to the ground, or forcefully evicting families at gunpoint, often appropriating black people's homes, neighborhoods, and towns. 1873, Colfax, Louisiana. In a coup to seize political power away from black residents, a white mob unalived 150 black men defending a post-war Reconstruction-era form of government. 1898, Wellington, North Carolina. A white mob overthrew a multiracial city government and then unalived dozens of black families and burned down their businesses. 1910, Slocum, Texas. White mob attacks a prosperous black farming community out of racial and economic resentment, unaliving dozens and forcing the survivors to flee whilst they stole their land and property. Forsyth County, Georgia, 1912, a white mob drove out over 1,000 black residents, unaliving all those who resisted and then seized their land and property. 1919, Elaine, Arkansas, hundreds of black sharecroppers were unalived by white mobs and federal troops after they organized a union to demand for fair wages. 1920, Ocoee, Florida, black citizens were unalived and their towns burned to the ground after they attempted to vote in a presidential election. 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, one of the wealthiest black communities that ever existed, was destroyed in a 2-day massacre where 35 blocks were destroyed and burned to the ground, with hundreds of black residents being unalived. 1923, Rosewood, Florida, a self-sufficient black town was annihilated by a white mob after a false accusation and the survivors could never return. 1943, Detroit, Michigan, racial tension over housing and jobs led to a deadly riot in which black neighborhoods were destroyed by the law enforcement. These are but some of the many horrific incidents that we can trace historically, likely the worst horrors we carry ancestrally, traumatically in our DNA. Government and local police often help carry out these attacks. They would harass, arrest, and hand black residents over to these savage white mobs like the KKK. These sundown towns were not only in the Deep South, they were all over the US, especially as many evicted black people fled the South through being terrorized. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. From 1932 to 1972, the US Health Service gave around 400 black men syphilis. They told the men that they were receiving a treatment due to the men having bad blood. Now you can imagine that these men may have had partners that they passed this horrific disease onto. This disease could have just spread throughout the Tuskegee community and beyond. They didn't offer treatment because they were basically collecting long-term data on the effects of the disease. How absolutely psychotic can you get? The sociopath's data says around 100 black men died directly because of the syphilis, but how many people died indirectly through having a compromised immune system from the syphilis? Now let's take a look at what the white supremacy hegemony has done to pivotal black leaders who are advocating for real change and empowerment for black people. Marcus Garvey, a prominent Jamaican political activist and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, faced significant opposition from US intelligence agencies, particularly during the 1920s. By 1919, parades with marching bands, uniforms, flags of red, black, and green had been regularly parading through Harlem streets. The Black Star Line stock drive had inspired working-class investors from New York to the Caribbean. The Negro World newspaper he created had traveled far and wide into colonies where its message made colonial governors nervous. So what was it that made Marcus Garvey a threat to white supremacy? Number 1, running a global membership organization with branch offices and officers. Number 2, publishing an international newspaper viewed as seditious by colonial authorities. Number 3, launching the Black Star Line, a commercial enterprise that symbolized economic independence, i.e. black entrepreneurship. US intelligence, particularly under J. Edgar Hoover, targeted Marcus Garvey due to his black empowerment activities and perceived threat to national security. They conducted surveillance, disrupted his organization, and ultimately led to his deportation after he was convicted of mail fraud in 1923. The trial wasn't only fought in court, it was fought in newspapers, rumor networks, and whispers in barbershops. The US government understood that if it could tarnish Garvey's reputation, it could weaken the UNIA from within. Garvey lost the legal battle but won the larger war of memory. His confrontation with the FBI exposed the lengths to which power will go to contain black freedom. Reverend George Lee. During the fight for black people to be able to vote and participate the right to do so under the Constitution, Reverend George Lee was one of the first black people to register in Mississippi County despite the death threats from angry racists. He gave a fiery speech at a black town hall empowering the black community to follow in his footsteps. However, a month later, he was fatally shot in his car while driving. His death was ruled an accident. They didn't unalive him for what he did. They unalived him for what he proved was possible. In 1931, Elmore Bolling married Bertha May Nowden Peterson. Together they built a life anchored in faith, work, and responsibility. Elmore became a deacon at Hopewell Baptist Church, not for show, but because service was how he understood manhood. He was a philanthropist without the word. People said, the only way Elmer wouldn't help you is if you didn't ask. No money, ride free. Can't pay a loan? Debt forgiven. He farmed cotton, corn, sugarcane, millet, peanuts, raised hogs, cows, goats, chickens, geese, employed people when no one else would, and he paid them well, often better than white landowners did. He provided housing for workers and lived by a simple belief. As long as a man will work, he has a place to stay. That belief, combined with land ownership, a store, trucks, and a gas tank, made him dangerous. Not because he broke the law, because he broke the lie. Too prosperous to be a Negro. On December 4th, 1947, Elmore Boylan was unalived. The excuse was flimsy, the motive was clear. White supremacy could tolerate black labor, it could not tolerate black independence. Medgar Wiley Evers. Medgar was a civil rights campaigner and a field secretary for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who was unalived in 1963 when he was struck by a sniper's bullet outside his house. Evers became the first martyr to the 1960s civil rights movement, and his death was a turning point for many in the struggle for equality, infusing other civil rights leaders with renewed determination to continue their struggle, despite the violent threats being made against them. The unaliving of Harry and Harrietta Moore. The civil rights power couple founded a chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in Brevard County. The two were teachers but worked to help black people vote, investigated hate crimes, and overall fought for racial equality. However, on a Christmas night, a handmade explosive of dynamite detonated under the couple's bed. 5 decades later, it was discovered that 4 KK members were behind the unaliving. Malcolm X. Malcolm was a prominent African-American leader and civil rights activist known for his advocacy for black empowerment, human rights, and self-defense. Malcolm X emphasized economic sovereignty as the idea that black communities should not rely on the benevolence of white America for financial support, but instead create their own pathways to economic freedom. He advocated for self-reliance and the establishment of independent economies to empower black people and ensure their economic liberation. Malcolm X was unalived in 1965 when 3 armed men shot him 21 times as he was preparing to speak in New York. The lawsuit alleges that a corrupt, unlawful, and unconstitutional relationship between law enforcement and the ruthless unalivers allowed for the unaliving. The unalivers were allegedly from the Nation of Islam, the religious organization that Malcolm X had split from due to corruption. A link between the agencies and the unalivers went unchecked for many years and was actively concealed, condoned, protected, and facilitated by government agents. The lawsuit says the NYPD, coordinated with the agencies, also detained members of Malcolm X's security team days before the shooting and intentionally removed their officers from inside the ballroom where he was shot. Federal agents, including undercover operatives, were in the ballroom during the unaliving and took no steps to intervene, the lawsuit alleges. Dr. Martin Luther King was a black civil rights activist who believed in a non-violent approach to activism and rebelling against social-economic injustice. The FBI's obsession with Dr. King in the years leading up to his unaliving in Memphis, April 4, 1968, pervasive surveillance, a malicious disinformation campaign, and open denunciation by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Coretta Scott King, wife of MLK, was adamant in her belief that the FBI had an involvement or were responsible for her husband's death right up until her passing in 2006. Her family filed a civil lawsuit in 1999 to force more information into the public eye, and a Memphis jury ruled that the local, state, and federal governments were liable for King's death. There is abundant evidence, Coretta King said after the verdict, of a major high-level conspiracy in the unaliving of my husband. The jury found the mafia and various government agencies were deeply involved in the unaliving. FBI-led unaliving of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. The deputy chairman of the National Black Panther Party and chair of the Illinois chapter took the Midwest by storm, spearhead initiatives to pour back into the black community, black economic sovereignty, partnering with the Rainbow Coalition and promoting black people being armed for protection. However, Hampton's fire against fascism and racism led the FBI to name him a threat. In 1969, they hired a mole to infiltrate the local Panther Party chapter and facilitate in his unaliving. The spy drugged Hampton, allowing FBI agents and Chicago PD officers to raid his home. Hampton was unalived in his sleep. The violent raid left 2 young leaders unalived and several other Black Panther members injured. This wasn't a typical police raid, it was a planned attack on the Black Liberation Movement. The effects of this brutal attack would go far beyond that apartment. This event showed the US government's fight against black empowerment. It revealed how far the state would go to stop dissent and keep white supremacy in place. From 1967 until 1971, police unalived 28 Black Panther Party members and injured and imprisoned many, many more. Under the cover of national security, COINTELPRO attacked civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and the Black Panther Party. Its methods included surveillance, infiltration, misinformation, and outright violence. The program's real nature was hidden until 1975 when activists exposed it by breaking into an FBI office. These are but a few of the prominent Black leaders who were unalived. Imagine a number of future potential leaders who were incarcerated or unalived before their time. Future generations need Black heroes. They need strong, beautiful, intelligent, empowering examples that they can emulate. COINTELPRO were actively trying to stop the rising of what they dubbed as a Black Messiah, who might unify and empower Black people to create real equality, sovereignty, and prosperity. How wickedly evil can you possibly get? Up until the 60s, white people could literally get away with any crime done to Black people. Black people could be unalived, RP'd, or incarcerated indefinitely for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now let's move on to the 80s and 90s and the crack epidemic. The crack cocaine epidemic emerged in the early 1980s, disproportionately affecting urban Black communities. Crack, a smokable form of cocaine, was cheap, highly addictive, and widely available, fueling a public health crisis. By the mid-1980s, cities like Los Angeles, Miami, and New York reported skyrocketing rates of addiction, crime, and incarceration, with Black communities bearing the brunt of the fallout. In 1996, investigative journalist Gary Webb, in his San Jose Mercury News series Dark Alliance, discovered that the CIA were supporting the Contras, a rebel group fighting Nicaragua's Sandinista government in an attempt to destabilize the region in the Reagan administration anti-communism era. Webb's investigation focused on people like Danilo Blandon and Norwin Meneses, Nicaraguan drug traffickers with ties to the Contras, who allegedly supplied cocaine to Los Angeles drug dealer Freeway Rick Ross. Ross is credited with helping spread crack cocaine in South Central Los Angeles, a predominantly Black area. Webb argued that the CIA's support for the Contras indirectly enabled the flow of cocaine into the United States, where it was processed into crack and distributed in the vulnerable communities. In 1999, the CIA released a report by its Inspector General, Frederick Heitz, acknowledging that the agency had worked with individuals and groups involved in drug trafficking during the Contra War. The report confirmed that the CIA had knowledge of drug-related activities by some Contra associates, but found no direct evidence that the agency itself orchestrated the trafficking or targeted Black communities specifically for crack distribution. Guess that's what happens when you investigate yourself. Former Drug Enforcement Administration DEA agent Celerino Castillo III and other whistleblowers claimed that the CIA ignored or protected drug trafficking operations linked to the Contras. Castillo documented suspicious activities at El Salvador's Ipango Air Base, a hub for Contra supply operations, where he alleged cocaine was smuggled with CIA complicity. The CIA and its defenders have consistently denied direct involvement in the crack epidemic, and that any drug trafficking by Contra affiliates was incidental and not agency directed. The war on drugs' harsh sentencing laws, such as the 100-to-1 disparity between penalties for crack and powder cocaine, disproportionately targeted Black users and dealers, leading to mass incarceration of Black people. Ask yourself these questions. Do you really think it's possible to traffic this amount of drugs into a global power like the United States, with all its military technology, security, and intelligence without their involvement? Where exactly do you think, say, a Black man like Rick Ross might acquire the means to traffic this huge amount of drugs from in the first place? You not think, say, it sounds suspicious that a group like the CIA were working with the same rebel group, the Contras, who were smuggling drugs into the Black communities in the United States? Especially with intelligence agencies' history and agenda to subjugate the Black community and stop the rising of what they called a Black Messiah, between drugs reaping havoc in the Black communities and the infiltration, rumor networks, the excessive arrests, harassment and incarceration of Black people by FBI and law enforcement. Gangs and gang-related issues became prevalent in the Black community. By 1971, 2 million Black people were being arrested each year. From 1986 to 1991, there were 2,611 citizens' complaints about the excessive force used by LAPD officers. From 1986 to 1990, 1,400 officers were investigated, yet only 1% were prosecuted. Black people were being arrested and criminalized for nothing, for simply being Black. In this controlled social structure, Black people began turning to drugs and crime as a means of survival and to escape that reality. Now let's talk about the 90s right up until present. From the 80s to the late 90s, hip hop was hitting its heights in the black community. At first, black artists were generally rapping in a positive manner about things of real value, like the social political predicament of the black man and woman. But the negative white supremacist psyop began to run amok in the form of gangster rap, where violence and derogatory terms towards women was popularized through music. Well-known rappers such as DMX have openly stated that the labels threatened to drop them if they didn't talk about negative stuff. So whether you believe that there is an industry-wide aim to criminalize the black community through music, there doesn't need to be one, because the overwhelming trauma done to lead up to this period was bound to express itself through our musically creative people, which sadly has done so much damage to our people. Music is such a powerful tool. An artist is like a magician that can captivate, create, or even destroy an individual, which shows you the power we creatively, musically gifted people have, and why there seems to be such an effort to subjugate us. We just need to flip the script back to love, knowledge, and transformation. So after all the information that you have now been presented with, do you think this is all just a series of uncoordinated events? Or do you think it is a coordinated system of white supremacy? Can you perceive the effect these experiences would have on black people and their communities to this day? Do you think black people should just simply get over it? The information that I have brought to your attention in this video has never been properly admitted by the global elites. The instigators, perpetrators, and profiteers of these heinous crimes were never incarcerated or even prosecuted, and our young people are still not being properly educated in this history. The dirty secrets swept away unacknowledged for so long that black people no longer know why our family environments and communities can be so dysfunctional. So much time has passed by without reconciling that this current white generation often says they aren't responsible for what white people did to our people in the past, or they call us victims, saying, "Did that happen to you though?" They have essentially answered their own ignorant questions and debunked their own claims. Because if they arrived in the US after slavery ended, they or their ancestors still profited from a white supremacist racial hierarchy that committed all the unethical crimes discussed, like the Homestead Act, the Black Codes, the Jim Crow laws, sundown towns, the KKK, the assassination of our leaders, etc. Whilst black people are still suffering from a past that they may or may not even be aware of, still struggling to see the ancient powerful creative being staring back at them in the mirror. I hope you know that our history doesn't start with our enslavement or by our being colonized. Human history starts in Africa. So too does civilization as we know it. This is Ibis Anan. Thank you for watching.
If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notifications, as my content often gets shadow banned on our various platforms' feeds. Please leave your comments and drop a like to help push the content out to more of our people. Big love and respect to all my Magi warrior out there. Hotep.